Hello everyone. Okay, I hope we're all well and happy. What we're going to look at today is the impact the EU has on UK policy, and then we're going to look at something called sovereignty and the impact the EU has had on sovereignty. Okay, so they're the main issues today, and I should by early next week finish off all the content. So I'm going to do one session next week on sovereignty and looking at has sovereignty moved away from Parliament and all that kind of stuff. So, last lesson was looking on my other computer at the booklet. We basically looked at the various institutions of the EU and how they operated. And as I said, you're not going to get an exam question on, evaluate the view that the European Council is more important than the European Parliament, anything like that. But it does fit into questions about decision making and sovereignty and where they lie. Okay, so part of your work you had to do was those questions about there being a democratic deficit in the EU, i.e. where the weaknesses in terms of democracy. Because obviously the only part that is directly elected, of course, is the European Parliament, and then critics argue that bit's directly elected, but it's not where decisions are made in the EU. Supporters, though, say that most of the EU is indirectly elected. So, in other words, elected politicians of the various member states are involved at high levels. For example, like how the Prime Minister and stuff meet at the Council of Europe every 4 weeks. So I got a fly on me. Meet at the European Council 4 times a year. They're obviously directly elected politicians from their member states. You could argue the European commissioners as well have been appointed by elected politicians from the various member states as well. So that's what supporters kind of claim. So it's up to you where you think the balance lies there. Of course, one issue, of course, if you have more of it directly elected, then the danger is that they'll therefore say we've got more legitimacy, therefore we should have more powers. So there's a bit of an emphasis, should be careful what you wish for those who believe that. Okay, so the European Union then had a big impact on certain policies. There's certain key industries which had a big role in, and one of the main ones is actually agriculture. And what you had to do for your work, your homework, was to look at the Common Agricultural Policy. Again, you don't need to know all the ins and outs. Critics claim that it favours French small farmers, and kind of the British model doesn't really fit in to the Common Agricultural Policy. The idea was to try and make sure there's enough food produced for Europe following the Second World War. And there's various targets involved where farmers have to try and grow X amount of certain crops. And they receive subsidies as well, so money from the European Union in order to do that. Due to environmental pressures and the fact that due to farming, more food is being produced kind of more easily, so to speak, it did create oversupply in the market in certain areas, and so now what you find is that the EU often gives subsidies to farmers not to grow food, to make sure some fields are left wild for wildlife purposes or for flooding purposes or whatever. So the Common Agricultural Policy is a very controversial policy, and of course it had quite a big impact on Britain, because obviously British farmers getting lots of subsidies from the EU to grow certain crops, or as I just said, not to grow certain crops. The Common Fisheries Policy, again, this involves fish, and it's about fishing rights off the coast. So basically, any EU member state can say we want to fish a certain amount of fishing stock from the British coast. Also, of course, Britain can say, well, we want to send some boats down to Spain and fish some whatever fish it is they have off the Spanish coast. Again, this reform's been criticised because, again, a bit like the Common Agricultural Policy, there are certain caps, there's certain limits put on how much fish can be actually taken from the sea. Again, a lot of this actually is down to environmental reasons, i.e. try not to take out too much fish from the sea, because otherwise they can't recover their populations. And so what tends to happen as a consequence is that fishermen will get a certain amount of fish. Once they've exceeded their quota of, say, cod or whatever it happens to be, because they can't sell the extra stuff they've got, they end up throwing it into the sea. So they end up throwing dead fish into the sea. So again, there's been issues around this. Lots of British fishermen are not very happy with the common fisheries policy. They don't like the fact Spanish and other countries' boats are taking fish off the English coast. They don't like the fact they have to throw some fish back into the sea. And actually, it's quite interesting in terms of Brexit. A lot of the fishing ports had a very high Brexit vote. Places like Grimsby, for example, some of those fishing communities in Cornwall and off the Scottish coast. Question 3 on there to do with the fat to tame case. This was about Spanish fishing basically, and what this decision actually said was, I won't go into the ins and outs of it, but it basically said that European law supersedes UK law. Essentially, that's what the fat to tame case stated. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense. Now, in terms of policy making in the UK, obviously the EU has a bigger impact on some departments than others. So like education department, for example, there's not a great deal of influence from the EU in that area. But if you're the agriculture minister, for example, then obviously there's a great big EU kind of interest there. And what's happened in Britain since we joined is that institutionally we've created bodies and committees and stuff to make sure that UK law is compliant with EU law before it is passed. So the Cabinet Office, for example, in the executive, they have a committee of the Cabinet which looks at EU affairs. There's the European and Global Issues Committee, and again, they kind of, they go and want to pass certain laws and certain things. They'll kind of do an EU test, if you like. Would this fit in with EU policy? Or is this going to go against EU policy in the future? So before a law is kind of even introduced, the executive kind of make sure it's EU proof. Because what they don't want to do is spend all that time passing a law, then just government goes against EU law or EU whatever's, and then it ends up being null and void. Regarding Parliament, obviously, because when the European Commission and all that process has passed their directives and in particular regulations, these things get scrutinised by Parliament. So the House of Commons have a European Scrutiny Committee which looks at various directives and regulations. The same is true in the House of Lords. It's called the EU Select Committee. Again, there's often too much for them to do, so they tend to look at just the main things as far as they can. Now, obviously, since we've left the EU, a lot of these institutions are going to disappear. So I imagine the House of Lords and House of Commons no longer have these particular committees. I imagine the Cabinet Office no longer has these various other committees to make sure UK law is kind of compliant with EU law. Okay then, so speaking of Brexit, obviously Britain left the EU with the referendum in 2017, or was it 16? I've forgotten now. 2016, wasn't it? But Britain's been like an awkward partner in some ways in Europe ever since it joined. And one problem Britain had was it joined the club a bit late. So obviously, when the EU first formed, France, Germany, they kind of made sure policies fitted into some of their interests, like the common agricultural policy. It really benefited French farmers. The Germans weren't particularly bothered by that. They were more interested in industrial policy. So obviously when Britain joined, a lot of the kind of fundamental bits of the EU had already been decided. And so Britain has had a slightly awkward role in the EU, and of course that's culminated, hasn't it, with the Brexit referendum in 2016. Now obviously Brexit's going to have a really big impact on these policies. So in many respects the UK no longer has to take heed of the common agricultural policy in terms of limiting the amount of product produced by farmers or encouraging farmers not to grow food, etc., etc. But of course it's led to the problem then is that if Britain's going to sell goods, agricultural goods to the European Union, you've got to meet the standards of the common agricultural policy. So if they've got a certain welfare for pigs or whatever, before they'll sell pigs in Europe, then obviously they're going to say to Britain, well, you need to make sure pigs in the UK are done to our standard. That's also true of industry, isn't it, as well? So, I don't know, imagine electrical equipment has a certain standard in the EU. If Britain wants to sell it to EU countries, they have to meet those standards. And one argument against leaving the EU, of course, was we'd have no longer any say on those standards. So when we're in the EU, at those various institutions, Britain could say, actually, we're unhappy with these standards, we think it should be this. Sometimes we got our way, sometimes we didn't. Of course, now we've left, we don't have that say. So we're going to have to meet EU standards if we want to sell anything abroad to the EU. without having any say on what those standards are. Now, regarding farmers, a lot of farmers are suddenly quite concerned because obviously they're getting quite lots of subsidies from the EU not to grow things or to grow certain products, and now of course they are wanting the British government to give them the same subsidies for, well, doing the same thing basically. And so there's also going to be a lot of negotiation between the EU government, between the UK government and farmers over that particular issue. The same true with the fisheries as well. In some ways, the fishermen were quite pleased that we left because they could catch what they wanted. But actually, in reality, if they want to sell fish to Europe, they're going to have to meet European standards for that. And also, of course, it could also mean that Britain will find it harder to sell the fish to EU if the EU have already met its quotas through, catching the fish off Spain or whatever. Now, what I'd like to do, I can't remember if I actually did this last time or not, so just in case I didn't do, there's a nice video on Teams about the common fisheries policy and fishermen and Brexit. It was done, I think it was done just after we left the EU, so there's obviously been some developments since. There's also a nice video on there with some questions about the border with Ireland, because again that's become a big issue with Brexit, about what do we do with this border with Ireland, at least all sorts of issues like the members of the Troubles that were had in Northern Ireland. So we're going to watch those two videos, okay, so hopefully they're relatively straightforward. And then what I want to do is think about sovereignty. So the first thing is, what is sovereignty? It's not what you have on your rings, they're sovereigns, okay? There's two types of sovereignty. Okay, there's legal sovereignty. Okay, this is sovereignty defined by law. And what it means is basically a person or an institution has unlimited legal authority to act for the state. Now, if you go back in time, that was obviously the monarch had those powers. Today it is Parliament. So Parliament has sole legal sovereignty. So Parliament has unlimited legal authority to act in the UK, which is why Parliament can make any law it wishes to, it can change any law it wishes to, it can amend any law it wishes to, it can decide it doesn't want to agree to various treaties it signed in the past. No law passed by Parliament is binding on successive Parliaments. So Parliament has legal sovereignty. So, for example, Parliament obviously set up, didn't it, the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, but because of legal sovereignty, there's nothing to stop the UK Parliament saying in 10 years, 20 years, whatever, we actually want to repeal those laws and have all that power back at Westminster and close down the Scottish Parliament. Okay, they actually did that with the Greater London Council, for example, in 1986. So the UK Parliament has sole sovereignty in the UK. Now, political sovereignty is kind of it's connected. What political sovereignty means is that it's kind of higher than legal sovereignty, and it basically means that Parliament receives its legal sovereignty from the people. So in theory, the people hold ultimate sovereignty, and the people delegate their sovereignty to Parliament in legal sovereignty. So political sovereignty is that held by the people, who give authority to Parliament, who then has legal authority to do what it likes, basically. But as we know, Parliament must come back to the people on a regular basis to have its sovereignty, if you like, renewed, I suppose, by an election. So that is what sovereignty is, and so what we're going to look at today and next week is, has sovereignty moved away from the UK Parliament elsewhere, or is it still held by the UK Parliament? So, discussing the EU, which is what we have been doing, you often hear arguments around sovereignty being bandied around. The EU takes away UK sovereignty, blah 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 blah. Okay, what I'd like to do is, there's a really nice video that was made by Jeremy Paxman about sovereignty and the EU, and there's questions in your booklet. So I'd like you to watch the video and answer those questions, and then what we'll do is that we'll have a chat about it next week and then talk about the other points you can make on the question about sovereignty.